Alrighty. I'm a little louder than Joey is. Yeah, I bumped Joey a tiny bit. Hopefully, it's a little bit better.
That should be okay. I can move the microphone a little closer.
Yeah. So, for anybody that's new, good friend of mine, Joey, who did the Warrior Darkness profile, was kind of wanting to help out a lot of our locals. The DFW scene is growing very rapidly, and we have a lot of players that are new and wanting to get a lot better at the game. And you know, it's this is a Final Fantasy is a very complicated game. There's a lot that you kind of learn the more you play, and Joey wanted a way to pass that information down to new players. And he went through and created this full slideshow and wanted to have me help present it. I'm very lucky that he's going to also let me record it, put it on YouTube for everyone else to watch in the future. Joey, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Happy to help.
And let's go ahead and let's start going in. So yeah, anybody in chat, if you have questions at any time, feel free to ask. We'll be here to guide you. If you need help with the basic how to play Final Fantasy, I'd recommend there's a really good Rudros video on it. It's pinned in the NA Facebook page. It's also on Rudros' channel, relatively high up. I know he's doing mostly Lorcana right now, but in general, Joey and I assume you know how to cast cards.
Just basic understanding of the game, kind of knowing like what, not necessarily every single card does, but kind of like relatively how to play the game. And just at this point, trying to figure out like what can I do. You probably played a few games yourself, maybe you've gone to a locals or two, and you kind of know the flow. It's more so focus on everything else around it, like how to not just improve yourself, but also to kind of get a bit more of an understanding of how some other decks may play. Simply put, Final Fantasy is probably one of the most diverse card games out there, where you can sit down, play 20 different games against 20 different people, and play maybe 18 to 19 different decks within that period of time. There's no other card game that plays like that, where you can sit and have that much variety at once. And it at times can be overwhelming, especially for new players when they're trying to figure out what singular cards do and then see 30 different cards in the next game and then 20 different cards in the next game. Not knowing how any of them play, not knowing if they're winning or they're losing, or even going in with a game plan sometimes. So the goal here is to kind of help with that and for some things that may not even be thinking about while they're playing.
I say even more so than that, you could play the same deck two different games in a row and it'll do completely different things.
Hmm.
Like the Warrior Darkness Retainer deck. One time you'll play it, you'll see nothing but Warriors of Darkness. And the next time you play it, it's all of a sudden just spamming the Backstreet Boys on you. So
Yep.
it's a very non-linear game in how it plays out. You see a lot of different aspects to different decks as you play. All right.
That's where the wonders of it.
So Joey put together. We have 7 different kind of sections to go through. General overview of gameplay, um, beating a defeatist mentality, how to make your decision making process, fixing your tells, kind of a short meta overview. We're gonna have a couple budget decks for people that are new to the game, want to pick up a second deck, or want to play a pretty decent deck at a low price, and then kind of a small section at the end for some questions. All right.
All right. So first jump will be for the general gameplay. So for when you're jumping into a general game state and when you're trying to figure out kind of like what's going on, especially towards the beginning, is if you can kind of identify how the opponent's deck plays. This will be once again once you get a few more locals, and especially if you have like some people that play the same deck over and over again, you need to go into the idea of how does the opponent's deck function and how do you want your deck to function. So if you're going against like an aggro deck, what are they going to do? They're going to try and toss out as many bodies as possible and swing for a game as quickly as they can. If you're going against a control deck, you have nothing to fear in the beginning of the game at all. But if you let the game go on too long, especially if you're playing on an aggro deck, you know that your goose is cooked if you let it go on too long. If you're hitting turn 8, turn 9 on your own turn, like your 8th or ninth turn, the game's probably over, depending on what the matchup may be. So once you get an idea of how a deck functions, and once again that will come along with meta knowledge, kind of figure out how you should be attempting to play into them, and especially what the game state will look like later, which will be covered in a later slide. If it's a control deck, if they're not finding backups, which once again is really bad for them, capitalize on it, push, because they aren't going to be able to do what they want. They have to either find their Shantotos, or they need to be overpaying for things that they really don't want to be overpaying for to deal with the problems you have, which control deck doesn't want. They want to be throwing down backups and getting to that late game situation. Um, Even if you're a deck that normally does not play aggro, you can shift your gameplay if you see them struggling to capitalize on that and push for aggression when you may normally not, which feels awkward to you, but may actually win you the game compared to I play backup, you play backup, I play backup, you play backup. I'm playing mid range, you're playing control. You like that. You like that 1-for-1. So feel comfortable kind of moving in what position that you want to play your deck as it moves on. And then, of course, for the second piece, how close are you to the game state you want to have? If you're not finding what you're needing, if you're a backup heavy deck and you don't see your backups, or you're an aggro deck like Knights and you cannot find Knights that are actually doing something for your hands, like 3 Steiners and 2 Charlottes, like what alternative options can you do with an awkward hand like that? What can you do, and is it worth it to just dump Steiner, dump Charlotte, pass, or is it better to put out something else and then pray you're going to draw into something that's going to help you a little bit more? So you may have to give up on those bread and butter plays if the game state calls for it too, whether you're ahead or behind. Just don't throw away your combo pieces or something good if you don't have to. And of course, don't allow the game to get out of hand in an aggro matchup too. Don't keep all of your combo pieces like, I can't throw these away, but at the same time get run over because you took 5 damage because you decided to hold your hand against an aggro matchup where it's very easy for them to put 2 more damage into you. So just be mindful of where the game is and what you may have to do or what you may have to give up.
Yeah, even like the most control-y of control decks, like the slowest decks possible, have things they can do to push the tempo. I think a really good example of this would be if you watch the first round of Top Cut. KP was playing against a mono win deck, and KP was playing a Earth Water Chaos Arc deck. It is one of the slowest decks in the game at actually closing it out. And on turn 1, he ended up actually going Thornton for Une and then casting the Une and completely emptying his hand, even though he's a control deck, because he wanted to try to force the Wind deck, which is also a super heavy control deck, to find an answer very quickly, or KP was going to run away with the game based on how powerful Une is as a card.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Mono Wind really has, outside of like Dryad, they really don't have really strong single target removal. And
Yeah.
especially in the beginning of the game where they have no backup sound, they are not removing that thing easily.
He had to find exactly Alexander, and if he didn't find Alexander plus a Wind 4 to cast, and even then you're forcing him to commit to a Wind 4 he didn't want to play.
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes there are weird lines like that you need to be smart about. So, in decisions like that can be the difference between winning and losing. And the fun thing about this game is sometimes it's correct and sometimes it isn't, and you get to kind of play test and learn and with your opponent basically.
Yep, absolutely. And some will come to just your own knowledge. What do you have in the deck that outs this weird situation? Is it likely you'll see it or likely not? And depending on what it is, it's, well, I either have to dig for this thing or I have to do something else because I can't let this state stick.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think we kind of covered just about all of this. So yeah, opponent's options. So one of the most important things, again, evaluating what your opponent's deck is doing at all times. If you're looking at your opponent and they have, 5 backups, there's a lot they can do. So you have to think, okay, well, if they top deck Warrior of Light, I might be in trouble. Maybe I should freeze the backup that prevents them from getting their Fire CP so they can't cast the Warrior of Light, right? Would be like a thing like that. If they've got a Chaos on board and they have 4 cards in hand, there's a decent chance they have an Arc. How do you stop that from happening? Little things like that can make a big difference. And then once you know what your opponent can do, you can then consider what you want to do in response. So, for example, if you see the Chaos on field, maybe you want to clear the Chaos without using a forward if you can. If you can. It's not always possible to. If your opponent isn't threatening you, maybe you should be threatening them to force them to play your game. And then lastly, this is a pretty big one, especially in the current meta. Know where your opponent's damage thresholds are and the general EX burst density of what they're doing. The biggest example of this is the Raffia control list. If you put that deck to damage 3, it will go all the way off on you every single time. Also, if you're attacking into Raffia control, they're going to have 20 EX bursts on the deck. So you have to be ready that when you attack, there's a very good chance that you're going to give them the resources to counterswing on you. Meanwhile, if you're playing against something like, say, Knights doesn't really have anything that they care about for damage thresholds. If they're on damage 3 or damage 5, it doesn't make a difference for the deck. And they're not playing a lot of EX bursts. So maybe it is safer to attack into a Knights deck once you get a little bit ahead. Little things like that can be the difference between winning and losing.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and especially with some decks have much more powerful EXs than others. Like if you're playing against any kind of water deck, 6 cost Leviathan is a very scary hit because it will remove a problem and give them a resource. They also have access to Thornton, or Earthwater also has Tyro. Most decks will have Tyro and Kusith, which are both just add a problem or basically get to a problem removal. And once again, it's keeping an eye on those damage thresholds too, because if you're thinking, I'll take it a little bit of a risk, I'll push them to damage 3 because I have 4 swings next turn and can kill them if they don't find an answer. If you hit a Tyro as that damage 3 against certain decks, like you might be done for, because you're putting them to that threshold they're looking for. They are searching the problem, the thing that you don't want to see off of that EX burst, and you may have completely swung the game because you think next turn I do have lethal, but they have a lot of resource. Maybe they already have a lot of backups, and it's like it's very likely they might have something. And then at that point, it's potentially think about that risk. But if they are like on 1 backup, 3 cards in hand, maybe even like 2 backups and like 3 cards in hand, some decks that may not be allowed, even if you hit an EX, to where they may not have enough CP to really be able to push it, depending on the deck. Like if it's a Refia control deck and they only have like 2 backups down, I don't mind putting them to damage 3, because even if they hit a Tyro, they're going to search a Paris. They might get the Refia, but if they don't have like 2 Warrior of Light backups, they still have to find a third or a fourth one at that point if Ferris and Refia are 2 of them. And they've dumped a decent amount of cards in hand to do that. They'd have 2 cards left in hand. So they'd have to specifically be able to drop a 2-drop backup in a color that they happen to have as well. So the odds of all of that coming together are fairly low, but it is something I would have to consider. If they already have like 4 backups down, 3 of them being Warriors of Light, then yeah, I don't want to push them to damage 3 here, because if they have a Ferris in hand, like I'm beating them a Refia.
Yeah, you're gonna face Refia, Arc, and Ferris all in one shot at that point.
Yeah, and it's like the game's, depending on the deck that you're playing, like the game's over. If they have all that coming down, then they have like an Amat in hand where you can't even Shantoto, it's like, that's it. Like
Yeah.
you've fed them the game because you put them to damage 3. So just be mindful of those. Don't just blindly swing. Do think about some decks. Most decks will not have those damage thresholds, but some of the ones in the meta do.
I'd say, and
Like,
also kind of think there are some cards that do self damage. Those can kind of push them over that damage threshold. So that's another thing to kind of be wary of. Self damage is usually a good thing for yourself if you're doing it. As counterintuitive as that sounds, it's not a bad thing to take some damage.
mm-hmm.
So if you're behind, what do you do? Well, there's a couple things. First thing, what is causing the problem? Why am I behind right now? Sometimes it's really obvious. You see their board, they have 4 forwards and a Ramza, and you're like, well, that's the problem. Other times, it might be a little bit trickier. Maybe they have, like, just a generally, 4 backups to your 1, and they just board wiped you. And the problem is that you're behind on getting set up, and they're going to overwhelm you with the advantage that way. Do you have ways of dealing with those? Well, if your opponent has the 4 forwards and the Ramza, maybe you can Shantoto and try to, deal with it that way. If they're out ramping you on backups, well, you have to decide, well, do I need to try to match that? Like, is that what you try to do in that situation? This is falling under the consider your options. Or do I need to just say, well, I can't catch up anymore, so I might as well try to go for the game? Which brings us to the third thing, is that sometimes when you're behind, the safe play will never let you win. If you're both on, like, if your opponent's on 5 backups and you're on 1, you may never catch up in backups, and if you did try to catch up, your opponent's going to win the game before you do. But maybe if you just slam 3 forwards, those forwards stick and you win the game anyway. Even a 5% chance of winning on a bad play is better than a 0% chance of winning on the safe play. Right?
It's also possible, too, like your opponent may have had a very aggressive start or a very strong start, and then they draw nothing for 2 to 3 turns. They, like, open just a bunch of forwards, they threaten to do with the forwards, and then they draw nothing but backups for 3 turns after you've killed 1 or 2 of their problems, which those backups may not do anything for them. They may add another card, which is great. The card they add is another backup. Next turn, they drop another backup, and now they're on 3 backups. That's cool, but they did nothing to you for another 2 turns, which gave you some time to put out some threats and actually start to do your game plan for a little bit. But if you just look at a board of 4 forwards, see your 1 backup, and you're thinking, man, I'm not playing Earth, I don't have Shantoto, I can't respond to this, and you just kind of scoop it up on the spot, or you start, I'm just going to toss my hand and kill 1 of these and pass, you've basically thrown the game for it because you've just kind of accepted I lose. There's nothing I can do here. When you may actually have answers in your deck that you have. Let's say you're on fire, you have demon. Demon could answer the board potentially, but you happen to not draw it for turn, so you just toss your hand away to kill one problem. And even if you now draw a demon for turn, you don't have the CP to play it, and you've just kind of messed yourself up. You might have to think, what in my deck can help me get there? But depending on what that is, depending on what I know I have to answer this board state, what am I going to need to make it work? That's kind of why at the end when I talked about the suboptimal play still, you still need to know what you can do to help you get back from that point, and you need to know what it's going to take to use those answers. Same thing with like Shantoto if you're on Earth. If you have 3 backups down, but you have no cards in hand, even if you draw Shantoto for turn, you're not going to be able to answer that board state. So you might have to accept I'm going to get punched for a turn, go to like 6 damage, but that way I keep a card in hand so I can play Shantoto for turn if I happen to draw it. Be mindful of the CP requirements of your outs, and also consider what EX bursts you have that will get you there. If you're on Lightning, do you have Odins in there? If you're on Earth, do you have Tyros, Kusis, things like that to get you there? If you're on Fire, do you have any sort of fiery experts that do damage? Just take all that into consideration too from a losing state. Even with like the Shiva deck I play, I accept that for the beginning of the game, I have nothing. I am behind, no matter what the opponent is, basically. Unless they are a hard control deck, I am behind for the first like 4 to 5 turns of the game. I'm just putting down backups and taking damage. But there are 24 experts in the deck, most of which are Shivas that dual or freeze cards, or cards that search cards. It's all about building those resources and understanding I'm going to be on like damage 4, damage 5, and then they're never going to touch me again because their board is constantly dual frozen. So they're never hitting me. But that's what goes into it. I'm going with the idea of I am going to be in a losing board state from the very beginning of the game. I'm going to be doing nothing but putting down backups. And if I'm against like a night deck or something, that's horrible because that's what I have to do. But they are going to hit EX bursts that are going to get me. They're going to hit Odins that are going to kill cards. They're going to hit Shivas that are going to dual freeze their forwards. They are potentially going to even hit things like Edward that are just randomly going to kill a knight. It's what you have to answer the board, and remember those answers might still be in your EX bursts. They don't always have to be in your main deck, like as card I'm going to physically play. Consider what you have that will get you through these losing board states, and sometimes play around it. You'll have those answers in there.
Yep. A couple of things real quick from the chat. Controller QQ says if your forward gets value off attacking, but you have to push them to a damage threshold, what does that mean? KP's right. You got to evaluate. Sometimes it's not worth attacking with a Man in Black or Zidane if you just know that you have to be ready for the consequences of what that attack means. Attacking is not free. Basically, is kind of the best way that I've heard it described. There's a very real chance that you attacking could give your opponent the fuel to win the game. And then, yeah, Rainfire's Joey is a Terra connoisseur.
I love that forecast Terra.
I've been trying to make it good for so long.
It did okay for a bit. It just folds to Mist Dragon, but there's, outside of running the 5-cost Ultimecia, there's not much you can do about that. You're on Ice Lightning. You have no counters to a Mist Dragon.
Yeah, and as Joey mentioned, some decks are okay playing from behind. When I play the Refugee control deck, I'm a-okay with taking damage while I get my backups in. When I play Retainers, the same thing. But if you're playing something like Knights, you really should never be on the back foot on like Knights or 13, because the moment you are, the game is probably not in your favor anymore.
Yeah. Some decks you have to keep that. You have to be the aggressor. You have to be the one on top of your opponent, because if they ever get like through it and then end up on top themselves, the decks are not made to be able to come back. Yeah. They are meant to be the ones on top.
It really just comes down to understanding what your deck does well, basically. Which you can learn the more you play, you start to figure the stuff out. And especially in practice games, try things. Maybe one time you say, well, what if I just go all in on forwards? What happens? Can my deck play in that situation? When you play practice games, you don't need to worry about winning because the game doesn't matter. You might as well learn something. It's kind of the best way to think about it. All right. Mentality. A lot of games you're going to lose a lot when you play the game. That's just kind of how it is. When you play TCGs, especially when you're new, other players have a lot more experience. They're going to make better decisions. They're going to beat you. And when you do that, you need to have the right way to process that loss. It doesn't do you any good to say, well, my opponent just drew the perfect cards all the time. That might have been what happened, and you can later on evaluate and say, well, I think I had a chance that game. My opponent drew really well, but oftentimes you should be trying to think, well, even if my opponent drew well, were there things I could do here and there that could have maybe do better? Maybe they did draw all the perfect cards, but you had a line here and there that might have been slightly better. You might have still lost even if you did that, but kind of understanding and processing what those decision points were and where things could have swung the game one way or another will end up making you a better player, even if, like I said, maybe your conclusion is, well, I was going to lose that game no matter what. Sometimes they just have it. But there are a lot of times where you'll think, well, if I'd done this and this and this, maybe I should have reevaluated this, or I should have counted the cards in my deck better. And sure, they might it might just happen to be where it's like, well, no matter what I did, I was going to lose that game. But maybe you didn't. Maybe there were other decisions that could have been made.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't do you any good to not try to learn from losing. You learn more from losing than you do from winning a lot of the time. Almost all the time, I would say.
Yep. Because when you take most of the time, players when they take a loss, they look back and see like what happened, compared to when you win, where you most of the time you're just like, all right, yep, I wiped that board, I got in the damage, I won, and then you just kind of move on. And even on some like tough wins, somewhere it was like 6-6 damage, you're both fighting for your life to try and make something happen, and then somehow you get something that lets you push in for that last damage and kill them. It's it's rough sometimes to really look it back with a full retrospective. What could I have done to like make that look better, or what could I have done to fix it? But when you are on the opposite side of that and they push that out and you managed to get that win, you might look back and see, on like the fifth turn, I should have played this back end instead of this one, which would have let me not overpay, and that one CP would have let me do something 3 turns later that would have let me keep my board a little bit better against, like that Ramza tapping down and killing my forward. I would have actually been able to put out a body that could have made it untargetable, per se. Like if I dropped a wall to protect my Yuffie would be something good in the Warrior Darkness Retainers. But because I paid my CP weird, I couldn't play the wool, or I tried to hold the wool so I could play it for like more value next turn, and now my Yuffie died. Because I just didn't think that was going to happen. So it's looking back in retrospect and seeing what could I have potentially done that would have helped, and something to potentially consider for next time as an option, compared to just, yeah, I did it, I won, and now I don't think about it, because then sometimes you eat that problem in a tournament and it costs you a match in like a LQ or a MAC Cup, compared to a loss at locals, which now taught you this is something that can happen, and I actually need to think about this for the future.
Honestly, the easiest way I can say to like make this work in your favor, learn to have fun even when you lose a game.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people kind of struggle with this a little bit, where they get really frustrated when they lose. Some of my favorite games of Final Fantasy TCG I've ever played, I've lost. And that's just like it is what it is. I remember even going back to Florida, the best of 3 that I played against Ryan was some absolutely fantastic Final Fantasy. We were making very, very involved decisions. There was a lot going on. I got to play Refia for 8 turns in a row, basically, after she kept getting killed. But like we were both, having fun with it. We were bantering, having a good time with that. And I lost the game, and I very clearly made a couple decisions here and there that I could have won the game had I made better ones. But that wasn't what was important. What was important was I enjoyed myself, I learned, and I those lessons that I have, I can take into my next couple of games, and I'm a better player for doing that. Oh, they're so good, KP. Yeah, KP's in chat saying when both players are playing other minds, they're so unlike any other game. They're so addicting. They really are. Like when 2 players are making like constant back and forth like haymakers, and the games are so like
Those are the good ones. I love those. But there's just so many cards on board sometimes too, and you're both just staring at each other like, I can't out your board, you can't out mine, but one of us has to do something eventually, and you're both just playing your outs, playing your responses.
yeah.
You think pretty good for a second, and then they dump it back on you and answer exactly what you just did to them, and it's just going back and reestablishing. It feels really fun to have those games where it feels so back and forth.
Yeah.
Those are the ones you remember, and whether you win or lose them, it just feels great. It really does.
No, like that is like, in my opinion, like that is the key, is finding a way to enjoy yourself almost no matter what happens in the game.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to I think it was the North Carolina one where I was streamed up with the Ice Retainers against a Water Ice aggro, and that game went on for an incredibly long period of time, where they pumped me to damage 5 and hit 2 of my Euphies in damage, which was my strongest response to the board. And we just it just got to the point where it's like, what can I do to get through this? What can I absolutely play for this? The guy's having to like read most of the cards I'm playing because he's never seen 5-drop wool in his life. And we're both just at a point where it's we built each other to a pressure point where neither of us could really answer the other until I finally was able to drop my 11 CP Shantoto to get through and get there. And even then, he was still trying to play some things to deny me cards and to deny the board state, and I was still having to answer these responses because I dumped my hand to do this. That was probably one of the most stressful games of FF I think I've ever played, and felt exhilarating when it was finally able to go through. And I know for him too, he was excited to see as many cards as he did because so many of them were just weird cards that he had never seen in his life.
Just wait until you get to Nats. You're just gonna be playing nothing. Nats is like wild because every game is like that. It's just about like Nats was it was one of the sweatiest rooms I think I've ever played of a card game. But there was so much high level Final Fantasy being played there. Oh man, it was so much fun.
I can't wait. I'm super excited for it.
Joey qualified at the local qualifier with the Warrior of Darkness retainer deck, which you can go check out in the rest of the channel. Decision making process. How do you know what the right decision to make at any given point is? So yeah, Final Fantasy ultimately comes down to it's a resource game. It is making decisions based on what you have in hand and what you have access to either establish threats, answer or remove threats, or prepare for a future turn. Those are like kind of your three major things that you're looking to do. And we talked about it a little bit before, but really your goal when you're doing that is you have to think what your deck is trying to do, you have to see what your opponent's doing, and you have to evaluate which one of your options gives you the best chance to win going forward. And you need to be thinking probably a couple turns in advance. I will say that like one of the things you start seeing good players do, like myself, I know that Ryan does this really, really well. We play relatively quickly, and the reason why is the entire time you're taking your turn, I'm planning out my entire next turn while that's happening. And I'm reevaluating as you're making moves. But I'm still thinking, okay, I probably want to do this into this into this. And I know usually about 3 moves in advance. And again, I'm reevaluating as things happen. But I know exactly what I want to do. And because I know what I want to do, I'm usually able to make smart decisions because of that. Do you have anything to add to that, Joey?
I really don't think so. The main thing is just once again going in with a game plan. You're not just there to toss out, ooh, this card looks pretty, I'm going to play this card. It's understanding what is your current goal, where do you want to see yourself in a couple of turns, and what are you hoping to sometimes even like draw into. You don't ever want to rely on, I mean, I'm going to draw this one of in my deck and I'm going to completely go off, but you instead are thinking, what realistically am I going to start drawing into? Or maybe I'll draw into a forward, maybe I'll finally draw into an even cost backup that I want to play on curve. Just what are you hoping to see? What are you hoping to do? And realistically, I like to look about 2 turns ahead and think, where do I want the board state to be in 2 turns? Potentially 1 turn ahead if things are getting a little bit crazy and I do not know what they're going to have. But as long as you're looking a turn or 2 ahead, especially to start, if you can at least look at next turn and think, what do I want to do next turn if I do this now? Then that's a good way to start building yourself up to the point where you can see several turns ahead, especially once you know what the opponent will be doing, once you know their deck too. Like if it's mono water, they're not going to be interacting with me my first like 2 to 3 turns. So for my next like 2 to 3 turns, what do I want to do? Do I want to put down backups? Do I want to toss on some forwards? Do I want to start searching for things to get me to combo pieces? Like what do I want to do with my few undisturbed turns? Compared to like a Knight's deck where it's like, cool, they're going to have 3 bodies on turn, 3 bodies on board at minimum by turn 2. What do I want to be doing next turn to be able to answer this before Ramza hits board and I'm just like, I'm getting cooked, especially if all of your answers are answers in forwards and not like backups or something. What do you want to be doing? Something to consider as time goes on.
Yep. I'm gonna leave this slide on here just a little bit longer because I forgot there was a second slide here.
Yeah, some of it's kind of tossed in here. But main thing is consider what kind of deck you are as well. Kind of jumping into more of like the second paragraph. If you're like a mid-range or an aggro deck, just make sure that you are kind of getting to where you want to be. Aggro, of course, get your bodies on board mid-range, especially because you are kind of flexible. Be mindful of, do you want to get some backups down or do you want to get some more forwards down? And what key pieces do you want to see against a specific matchup? Because mid-range tends to be a lot more flexible than most other decks because you can play aggressive or control compared to aggro where it's you're going face, and control where it's you're putting down backups in the beginning. There's very few times where you have alternative options. Doesn't mean you can't, but it's a lot more rare. So just keep an eye on things, and finally, be careful of what you discard, especially if you know it's good into a particular matchup. I've had some really awkward hands where I will sometimes just pass on a really weird hand because I don't want to discard my Yuffie to play my 1-win backup. Or I don't want to pitch 3 to play the Yuffie because I really want to play the other backups in my hand, and I don't want to pitch cards to play her. Don't throw away something that you know is going to win you a matchup, or if it's just an extremely good card that you really want to have right now. Be
Yeah,
Take an awkward turn if you have to, because you will probably draw into something else that you can actually discard.
I think similarly, don't be afraid to throw away specific cards too. I remember like one of the times I tried to get a bunch of friends that play Magic into the game. One of my friends literally looked at me in the eye and said, "How do you play this game? What do you mean?" He said, "Well, every single card in my hand is live at all times, and I can't imagine throwing away like a bomb to play this crappy backup down." And it's like that's just kind of what you do sometimes in the game. Like there are times where you have to discard your best card in your deck to play a backup, and that just will be a thing, and you need to recognize the difference is when you should do that and when your entire game plan will fold if you don't have access to that card. Especially if you're not in like Earth and don't have the ability to recur a card. Like if you're playing Mono Wind, if you discard a Lulu, you will never get that Lulu back, no matter what you do. So you need to recognize that, well, I really want to get this backup down. Is it worth losing this Lulu forever? Sometimes the answer will be yes. You can discard the Lulu or the Yuffie or the Refia, and sometimes it won't be yes, and sometimes you have to go slow because you just happen to draw too many bombs and you can't discard them because you might not ever actually see them again.
Yep. It depends on the hands, it depends on the matchup, and it does also kind of depend on what game state you're wanting to do. And it depends on the ratios too. Like if you have 3 of that answer in your deck, like for me, I don't mind sometimes tossing Noctis out of hand, especially in like the first turn, because I know there's 2 more in the deck. And he's an Earth or a Wind, which is going to let me play like a Northstalin per turn, which is, I'd love to just play Northstalin pass on my turn 1, if I know that's all I need to do. But like discarding a Noctis and discarding like a Prompto or something, those two together feels kind of awkward because both of them are very good cards. But tossing down a turn 1 Northstalin is much more valuable than keeping those 2 forwards in hand. So do keep in mind for it, but once again, if you have like an absolute like auto win card into something, then do be mindful on those. But just once again, keep it as a ratio. If you're only on 1 of that thing in the deck, then you probably don't want to throw it away. But if you have 3 of it, then over the course of the game, you will probably draw into another copy of it.
Don't pitch your set of Randall against Knights, basically, if you only have one copy of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That you do not do.
How do you handle watching your opponent directly grab an answer on a play they've predicted you're going to make? You just need to say, well, if they've got an answer to my answer, what's the next level? If you had an aggro board state and they grabbed a Shantoto, maybe you should play a backup on that turn so that you can recover a little bit easier when they do spend. Like Shantoto in like a lot of answers will be expensive. Do you have time to answer that answer? It goes to a card like Shantoto, the answer might actually be yes. Maybe you do have a turn to kind of, even if you're an aggro deck, if you get Shantoto, maybe that one backup you play will give you the value on a future turn to make up for the CP difference when the Shantoto clears you. Maybe you say, well, they have an Une on the field, which was their answer to what I was doing. I really needed to find the answer right now. It very much boils down to like the term is threat assessment, basically. What is the problem? How long do I have to answer it? And it's going to be different depending on the game state and what you have access to at any given time.
Yep, and sometimes too, be a little mindful, because I've seen some players win games with this, is sometimes just the threat of the threat keeps a player in check.
Mm-hmm.
You go against like a Soiree deck, you hit a Thornton and they search a Shantoto. Sometimes there hits a point where you need to give them enough of a threat to make them use their threat. Like they have to discard 3 cards to play that Shantoto sometimes. They're tossing 4 cards to kill 3 of yours, and although it doesn't feel great, sometimes players will just physically stop playing forwards because they know the opponent has a Shantoto in hand, and then they'll drop something like an Une, bounce a forward, bounce your 1 backup. You have your 2 forwards, but now you're still too scared to want to drop a forward because, like, did your hand play a forward because of the Shantoto, so you pass. They'll play something else. They'll play Elvis, kill one of your other forwards. And they've established an Une and an Elvis while you have done nothing because you're just totally scared of the Shantoto they search. It's, once again, it's as Ghoul kind of put, the threat assessment. Be mindful of answers that they can have, but also do not let them get away with, basically, like, let them get away with everything for free. Like, it's criminal sometimes of how safe players will play when they know the opponent has an answer. Sometimes you still have to force it, even knowing they have it. because it might feel awkward to them to have to play it. Once again, discarding 3 cards to play Shantoto for some decks can still feel bad because they're discarding cards they might want to keep. But you sometimes have to force it. Just be mindful of the fact they have it, but once again, consider, am I going to literally lose the game if I just start playing nothing because I'm just that scared of the card? Consider that back and forth and consider that threat evaluation. Is it worth playing one more card and forcing the Shantoto? Or is it worth waiting a little bit, seeing if they have an answer or not? And if they don't, then I can push more aggressively. Or if they end up having a different option, do I have to now still put down more forwards? Because if I give them another turn of nothing, they're just going to play something else. And at this point, I'm so behind and they still have the problem. Consider that as matchup knowledge goes on too.
All right. So talking a little bit about tells, I will straight up say I think this is a little bit overrated in general, but also you can accidentally give away information to your opponent that you don't need to. Generally, some simple stuff you could be doing. You know, if you're checking your break zone a couple times, your opponent might guess, okay, he's probably got a Kuseth in hand or something that's going to go in the break zone, right? Or if you're pausing on everything they do, they might guess that maybe you do have some kind of a response. Generally, I don't think it's that big of a deal usually to do stuff like that. But if you do care about this and you want to try to conceal information, maybe you do just kind of say, okay, sit there, be relatively quiet, or do the opposite. I'm kind of the opposite in tournaments. I chat. I'm a chatty person. I like to talk. I like to have fun while doing it. And I think that generally makes it kind of hard to understand what I'm doing when I'm doing that. 'Cause, if I'm always talking, you don't know the difference between when I have a response and when I don't have a response. Basically, as long as you're doing the same thing most of the time, it's going to be very hard for your opponent to know when you have something and when you don't.
Absolutely. And I'll say most of it does come from especially new players, like new ones that are new to card games. I'd say are the ones where that kind of shows a lot more, where they'll lean forward a lot when there's a lot of responses or they have something they really want to use. Sometimes they'll just lean back in their chair and just kind of like, you can tell by their face, like they really don't like what's happening. They probably don't have a response. They probably aren't going to like what you're doing, and they're probably going to eat your stuff. And the big thing is, especially, and this one I kind of notice in higher level play to an extent, is the continuously reading cards. Well, especially if they're looking at the opponent's card like over and over again, it's because it's a problem. Or if it's a card that we know that they know, like it's not something that's oddly played, and they're still looking at a card again, most of the time this is a problem.
Yeah.
Or there's something about this card that is causing something to be awkward. And if they're looking at their own card sometimes, where it's like they definitely know what their cards do, especially at a high level tournament, it's they are looking for an answer. They're somehow thinking like, what in this card is going to help me get me there sometimes, or is there any kind of limitation on this that's going to keep me from doing something. Uh, if you go to like, once again, the high level tournaments, or if you go to some kind of major regional, it doesn't really matter for which card game, it could be any card game, and you go to the high tables in the final rounds, you will notice that a lot of the players have the same energy. They seem very focused, they seem into it, serious expression, they aren't really moving that much. Most of them will keep their cards down on the table, or even if the opponent gives them a chance to respond, they will still pick up their hand, look at it, debate for a second, and then put the hand back down and say that's fine. And it doesn't really tell for the opponent, do they have an answer? Do they have nothing? Are they upset about what I'm doing? Are they content that that's what I did for my turn because it totally plays into something they're going to do on their turn? They give away as little information as possible. And it shows with their face, their expression, their motions, their everything. That's fine at the high level, but like in a local tournament, like it really doesn't matter. Like I'm totally fine kind of doing the same things, you like chatting away, and like I can totally get into like, man, you had that. Like I really don't mind in a local tournament having some fun with that. But just if you are someone that really like wants to take it seriously, or especially once again at like local qualifiers and especially the materia cups coming up, just be mindful of those physical tells that you give your opponent, and even sometimes those audio tells, like that. Yeah, that's fine. Like sounding defeated about something because it lets them know, like, cool, they really don't like what I just did, or they really don't have an answer to it.
Yeah, I'd say the last
So,
thing is be careful reading into this stuff too much, because if someone catches on you reading into it, they will take you to town sometimes with it if they know that you're doing it. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind, basically. Like, just be careful is kind of the best way of putting it.
yeah, I've done that before too. Like the faking tells,
Yeah.
especially the big one. Some people do. Like the common one is like faking that you have a response, where people like actually, and they'll like look at their cards in their hand, then nope, nothing. That's fine. So yeah, as School put, don't overdo it too much. But if you are someone that realizes like, I wonder how they always seem to know that I don't have a response to something, just think about it for yourself and say, is this something that I tend to be doing? Like, am I actually like leaning back in my chair a lot or something? Just try and focus on maybe one or two things, and then just see if you can remove those. But definitely, like, this isn't going to make the difference between a great or a good player. It's just something you can kind of think about if you're trying to do any kind of small things you can to try and help yourself.
All right, we're gonna do kind of a little bit of a rapid fire, going over kind of meta decks, stuff that you could run into at a tournament. I tend to have a lot like bigger breakdowns for these when I talk about tier lists and stuff like that. This is not going to be a full tier list or anything like that. This is just a bunch of decks that are good that if you go to a tournament you would expect to see.
Yep. And then I've tossed in a few in there as well, which although may not always be like tournament played, they are at least decks where you have to play kind of differently into them than you have to into most. So there'll be a few in there, but as for the most part, most of these are going to be decks that you will actually see in tournaments.
Yeah. So first deck on the list, Mono Water. Generally, this is kind of a ramp, kind of between mid range and control, I would say. It's a little slow to get going, but like the late game payoffs with like a 3 CP Lev 6 thanks to Lena. Ash is just an insanely strong card. It's a deck that does very well into aggression because it's very happy going late. And it has a lot of tools to slow the game state down to where it will end up being okay once it gets there. The biggest problem is the deck can be a little slow to get going. Do you have anything to add to that, Joey?
Not too much. I'll say that once again, they don't really have a ton of hard removal. They have some ways to bounce cards back to deck, which once again, like Tidus LB is incredible for all that it does.
Yeah.
And they do have access to things like 6-cost Levy, which is an incredibly strong EX burst.
Yeah.
But yeah, they don't have a ton of kill potential. You aren't gonna ever have to worry about, man, I have no forwards on board and I'm on damage 2 and I might just die in 2 turns. Like Mono Water isn't gonna toss out that many forwards to realistically be able to kill you quickly.
Yeah.
You have some time to get going with what you do, but they have a ton of answers to everything. And they will almost never, outside of the first few turns, they will never be caught with a small hand. They will always have something they can do. So it is just something to consider with Mono Water. Just, if you can, push quickly and just be ready for some incredible EX bursts, especially if you hit those 6-cost levies. Which in my theory is that it's never not going to happen. It's just a question of what damage you're going to hit it. That card exists to be hit in the EX burst, and I refuse to believe otherwise.
Chaos Arc. I always consider this a modifier. There's like Earth Lightning, Earth Water, and Mono Earth are like the big ones right now. Generally, Chaos Arc is going to be a control deck, much like the Mono Water. They're going to get a lot of backups down early. They're going to run a lot of answers to wide board states because they're not going to be running a lot of forwards themselves. And they're going to be using their removal suite, and then they have a really sick payoff in Chaos Arc. So Chaos gets cheaper the more colors you have to play, and then Arc is literally free if you have a Chaos on field. So they get to kind of steal one of your forwards, and then break another one, and then make you discard 2 cards. It's generally pretty flexible in what it does. The biggest downside is they are usually playing 4 to 6 dark cards. It's incorrect to play 4, but some people do it anyway. And so they will be a little slow, and they can break on that at times. And they do have to kind of line up, like it's a 2-card combo. They have to, like, Arc without Chaos is a pretty big brick. And Chaos without Arc is only okay. They really have to kind of find those, and then like the Man in Black or the Une to like repeat the combo. And if they can't do that, then in general, you can kind of run away with the game in that situation.
Yeah, not too much add on for that one. That's kind of how it is. Just be mindful. They do also struggle a little bit more to monocolored decks because the Chaos becomes a 9-cost, which isn't great.
Yeah, and there are ways to play around this too, where you can like avoid casting like off-color cards potentially early if you think they might have a Chaos in hand. Any kind of hand disruption, like if you can make them discard with this, you can make it really awkward because maybe they have Chaos and Arc in hand. They don't want to ditch them. So like they can be vulnerable to discard. Anything like a Zidane or targeted removal from the hand is really, really potent against them as well. You can line them up where they have a lot of really bad cards in hand. So.
Yep, and just leave them with it. Like if their hand is just an Arc in hand and you hit them with Zidane, like you can just leave them with the Arc sometimes because that Arc is doing nothing. It's a dead card in their hand.
Yeah. Another good point from chat. Do not use backup Shantoto against them if you can help it, because Chaos becomes completely free if she's on field.
Yep.
Don't do that.
Don't do it unless you literally want to hand them the game most of the time, or if it
Uh,
is like a I have to do this or I lose.
it's like an emergency situation, yeah.
Yeah.
Mono Earth. So Mono Earth is another ramp deck. It's going to try to get 5 backups down, and then it's going to try to enable. It's kind of funny because it's a mono deck that plays a lot of multi-element cards because one of Earth's kind of core element things it does is it color fixes for other colors. So between Leo and Riku, they can kind of play a lot of different forwards, most notably the 4-color Warrior of Light. And they get to use a lot of like off-color LB cards like Cloud and Tidus. So some of the biggest strengths, lots of very powerful removal. Ignis is really good. They get to play the Shantoto backup. Genova Synthesis. Earth is kind of like the board wipe element as well, on top of being the color fixing element. Some of the weaknesses, it's a little bit expensive. Like a lot of the cards you're playing are not cheap. It really needs to see backups early. If it doesn't, it's in a really, really bad state. And yeah, like those are kind of the biggest things. Like the high curve on Earth cards is kind of a bit of a problem. You know, a lot of cards will cost 4, 5, 6, 7, as opposed to a lot of decks where you can develop threats for 2 CP very early. So Mono Earth really does not have a lot that it likes to do early outside of playing stuff like a Shantoto to try to clear the board.
Mm-hmm.
Earth Water summons, usually this will get paired with Chaos Arc, but it's good to kind of know that like the variant here is a little bit different. Generally, you're going to see cards like Une, just infinitely recur summons. Garnet is one of the best commons ever printed. And the deck is going to be very, very, very focused on using those summons to kind of snowball the game in their favor. Some of the weaknesses, it's very low on forward count. Usually you'll see these decks with anywhere from 15 all the way down to I've seen as low as 9 forwards. So their ability to close out games can be very slow. But they do have a lot of answers and ways to slow down aggression again. Water and Earth are like the 2 best elements at stopping you from dying. So these decks are very comfortable with just playing a very slow, grinded out game. So now we're getting into kind of more mid-range away from control. This is Soiree. It's kind of the classic mid-range deck ever since it was printed in Opus 16. And the game plan is relatively simple. They want to get a bunch of Soiree backups down. They want to get 1 water backup down. They want to be able to cast Warrior of Light. And they want to kind of run away with the game. Basically be able to either pivot between an aggro game plan if they need to. You can go like Madame Edel. You can revive another forward. You end up with like 2 forwards on field very quickly. Edel gives your field a bit of protection. Or they want to kind of ramp backups, get to 4 or 5 backups, and then play stuff like Warrior of Light or Fusoya, or a lot of these like kind of 4-element payloads. Some of the strengths of playing Soiree over other 4-color elements, a lot of very strong EX bursts in Soiree. You have cards like Amber, which is just a fantastic backup. Elvis is one of the strongest EX bursts for removal in the game. Usually they'll be running a Thornton for their water, so they have another really strong EX burst there. Some of the weaknesses, they're relatively reliant on Shinju. They're also like very even costed, so actually their curve can be a little awkward. Usually they want to get like Amber and Shinju down on turn 1, so their next turn they can play another even cost backup. But they don't have a lot of odd cost cards in the deck in general. So you can kind of like get them into awkward situations if you're kind of either freezing backups or moving backups. And lastly, it's kind of got a low ceiling. It really is, because the Soiree cards tend to take up a lot of space, and a lot of the cards were printed now 7 sets ago at this point. There's been a lot of change in the game since then, and the cards have not aged super, super well. They're strong, but there's a lot of other very powerful things that you could be running if you don't have to run the Soiree cards.
It's it's also just kind of telegraphed. Like the initial parts of the game, they really want to get to like Amber, Shinju, Madame Metal, and most of the time in their first few turns is exactly what they're going to be aiming to do. It's basically, no matter what you are playing, you know what they're doing for the first few turns. They're trying to find some situation to get to these and find a way to, preferably about 3 to 4 backups as quick as they can. Most of the time, almost always being the exact same ones. That's why they do usually require some of those EX bursts to go off in the beginning, and why some of them are so powerful, and why the deck continues to do well sometimes because of how strong the EX bursts they get to run are. Tyro, Thornton, Elvis, Kusith. They have a lot in there that is able to usually get them there. But yeah, and once again, it is also a fairly low skill floor because it is fairly simple in how you want to play at the beginning, so it is relatively nice for new players too that are trying to get into things, because especially for once again those first returns, the deck kind of plays itself. It kind of wants to get to the same point every single time, and then from there you get a little bit of flexibility in what you want to do.
Yeah, and if outside of 4-color Warrior of Light, it's actually a relatively cheap deck, which is nice.
Hmm.
Um,
I think the only thing that comes to mind, like expensive, realistically, would be Thornton. I don't know how much.
Thornton's in the anniversary box.
Oh, then never mind. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think it's
Warrior of Light, but like you could still learn the game on the deck without Warrior of Light. It's not necessary for the deck to actually like function. Ice Lightning. This is kind of aggro mid range. You'll see a lot of ability to kind of lock your opponent out of the game with dull freezes, discards, things like that. Some of the weaknesses, it actually has. It's funny. Ice Lightning has a lot of very, very good backups, like really good backup engines. Just for whatever reason, a lot of good Lightning backups search Ice backups, as it turns out. The downside of Ice Lightning is that once you get out of the early game, a lot of what Ice Lightning does for disruption is not nearly as strong. Dull Freezing is kind of like it's like really strong early, especially if you can hit backups, but it gets a lot weaker the longer the game goes on. And yeah, I don't think there's too much. It's one of those things like when you play against Ice Lightning, you kind of understand it, but there's a lot of really, really strong Ice Lightning cards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and once again, just untargetable bodies are kind of rough too, especially if those bodies are big. Yuffie is a massive problem for that deck.
Mm-hmm.
They have answers to her, but if it's like a general back and forth game state and Yuffie hits board, then most of the time that deck is gonna really struggle to get through it. They really have to kind of see Rug in particular to get through it. Rug or Sephiroth if they're on Sephi.
Megissa, this is like a combo aggro deck. Basically, if you can self-ping Megissa, she gets to just play a forward from the deck for free. Which is really, really powerful. You get to kind of cheat a lot of CP and a lot of very powerful forwards into play. So, some of the weaknesses, the deck is completely reliant on Megissa. If you can remove her text, if you can stop her from getting her ability off, you can kind of 2-for-1 your opponent where they can like pay to ping their Megissa with some damage, and then you say the Megissa is either gone or doesn't have any text. You can really put yourself in a good situation by kind of 2-for-1ing them. And then it also is very aggressive. It's not really able to like rebuild once it goes late. It doesn't play enough backups to do something like a Montleonis usually. It's very reliant on the early turns and getting its combo off for the deck to actually have good success. There's a reason that there's like a couple of really good players that play this deck, and you don't see it a ton outside of that. It's also relatively hard to pilot because of that too. I think it's one of the harder aggro combo decks to play.
Yep. Especially if you can't find the Megissa. If you get one of those games where you don't have Megissa, it's how do you play the game?
Yeah.
When you can't just, your entire game plan is trying to cheat things out, and you don't see the thing that helps you cheat the things out, how are you supposed to play the deck? The good pilots know how to, and the people that don't, just, you can kind of tell with the way they're playing it, they struggle a little bit.
Storm in general. So the goal is really simple in Storm. It's going to get backups down, it's going to cast a bunch of cards, draw a bunch of cards, and then it's going to wipe your field and kill you. This is one of the hardest decks in the game to play well. Just generally because it struggles so much with one of the most common things in the game, which is aggro. If you go to large tournaments, you're going to see a lot of people playing decks like Knights and 13, and Wind as a deck can really struggle to slow those down. However, it has probably the strongest late game in the entire game. And the other thing is that, like, when a good player plays Wind, it's a completely different deck. It is so explosive and so powerful. You'll see a lot of different variants of it. Ice Wind, Earth Wind, Mono Wind. But generally the game plan is going to be the same. It's going to ramp backups. It's going to... once it ramps the backups, it's going to cast a bunch of cards. It's going to build a huge board. And it's going to be basically unstoppable once it gets going. A couple things to keep in mind against Wind. If you have the ability to slam early forwards against them, you absolutely should. Any early damage pressure or early card advantage you can do is huge because their first couple turns are just going to be setting up. The other thing is, if you have interaction on your opponent's turn, try to think about what the best time to use it is. A card like Mist Dragon is a card that you might not think is really, really strong in the matchup, but if you time it really well to cut off something like a Lulu or an Azura from getting what the intended target was, you might shut their turn down entirely, which gives you just enough time to win past their like super strong late game. Knights. This is the premier aggro of the format. They're going to slam Corilla. Corilla's going to flip the top 5 cards of the deck. It's going to play a bunch of forwards. They're going to try to kill you before you can stop them. Its strengths. Knights' bodies tend to be very, very large, and they tend to get a lot of them on the field very, very cheaply. I've seen Corilla be effectively a 3 CP forward that spat out 2 other forwards that are also disrupting the opponent, because one of them was Delita and the other one was Laswell. You'll see a lot of Knights players will actually kind of like slow roll it a little bit, where they'll kind of play Corilla or Ramza and kind of sit on them for a little bit before they really go for game. Because a card like Ramza actually gives them a lot of removal and pressure that they might lose the attack. And they have a lot of access to Amaterasu. A card like Moody doesn't have to search Corilla; it can search Amaterasu. It's also relatively easy to play, so you'll see a lot of newer players do very well with it, and not like that's actually a big strength, especially in a large tournament when you're playing 7-8 rounds of a tournament. The easier your deck is to play, the more effective you're going to be on it in round 7 and round 8. When you're playing a deck like Mono Wind, Mono Water, but at the end of the day, you might be tired and making more mistakes. Knights will help you through those situations where you're not playing optimally, which is that's a big advantage of a deck. Yep. The weaknesses in Knights, there's not a lot of other game plans. It can, I've seen the deck on as few as 6 backups, and it sometimes doesn't have anything to do with those. It'll play without those a lot of the time. And if it gets answered very cheaply, maybe like a Shantoto without an Amat or a Shadow Lord, they might just never recover from that. I think that pretty much explains it. It's one of those decks when you play it the first time, you kind of understand exactly what it does.
Yeah, it's once again, as Go put it, it is a simple deck to pilot, and it's also a simple deck to, once you sit down and play against it, you kind of realize, oh, this is what it does, and it doesn't really change much.
It's very hard to play against, though.
It is. If your deck cannot deal with it, especially if it doesn't have good ways to just outright kill bodies, then you're going to struggle, especially if you are especially fire decks where it's a lot of ping-based removal. With Corilla on board, you really don't have a ton of ways to answer that board anymore. Yep. Because pinging is not going to work while she's on board. You have to just outright kill the card or smack it so big it dies in one shot. It's a little tricky for that, but at the same time, Knights, outside of, once again, kind of like Ramza and Garland, they don't have too much removal themselves. They're trying to go wide and hit you with big bodies.
Yep.
So you can get into that awkward point where neither of you can kind of out the other real well. But if you're able to, and it just kind of gets into a back and forth gameplay where neither of you are doing too much, then Ramza will eventually kind of win the game on its own.
Ice Earth, this is another control deck. It's kind of I would say it's probably the best way of playing a discard focused deck, where you get to kind of what Ice Earth does is it tends to build backups and attack your hand. And they try to put you in a lose-lose situation of you have to commit your cards to the field because they're going to rip your hand out from under you if you keep it. But the Earth cards give them kind of protection where if you dump your entire hand, they can just remove their stuff. It's a very awkward deck to play against. I really don't like playing against it personally, but it also is a deck that can be struggling a lot. It's kind of struggling right now quite a bit because it actually does not handle some of the answers in the meta right now super well. A couple ways to play around it. I always call it, when your push turn against Ice Earth is. There is a point where it is not worth holding cards in your hand anymore because you're just giving them fuel to discard you with, at which point cards like Weiss and Biblos actually have text again. And at that point, you have to say, well, if they have the removal or answer, they have the removal or the answer. And you kind of go for it. And you do have time against Ice Earth, which is really good. Even if you don't always have you don't always have the ability to build cards in hand, you do usually have time to draw into your answers, which is good. I think that...
Oh yeah. They also don't have a lot of kill pressure. Although they do build up quite a lot of forwards. A lot of the time, their forwards are kind of weak. So if they don't have things dual frozen out, they usually can't swing too often. It also has a fairly high skill floor. If things are not going well for the Ice Earth player, or the opponent is not keeping a hand sometimes, which is why I left the no hand, no discard as a weakness, because if there's no cards to discard, you can't dual freeze things half the time. It then becomes a little tricky on what do I need to do with the resources I have. They also don't have, outside of Kusith, really any good ways of getting back the resources. Robo Akbol, if they're on a crystal package, and Kusith are realistically some of the only ways outside of Ice Shantoto, but most of the time they're not running that because they're on the Earth Shantoto backup. You have to play a fairly honest game with the opponent. The deck will not be able to really generate its own advantage. It is all about, I'm going to play a normal game, and I'm going to tax you out of the game. And if it fails to do that, the deck can really struggle. And Yuffie is also just like on her own almost wins this matchup because she'll reactivate all the 4s that you've dual frozen. Can block out Biblos, can block out Weiss still even when he becomes untargetable. Yuffie can almost single-handedly on her own win this matchup.
Fire Water Twins. This is kind of you get to play a lot of the good Fire and Water cards. Tyvis is kind of a deck in a can card. You kind of can play Tyvis, and he kind of will build you a board by himself. And then you happen to be in Fire and Water, which means that playing Twins are really good. This deck tends to pivot very well between being a mid-range deck or an aggro deck, depending on what it needs to be. Sometimes you can slam out both Twins early and run the opponent down very quickly while they don't have time to answer those. Sometimes you can build backups, then play Tyvis, and just go from there. It's a very flexible deck in that way.
And has quite a few removal, or not just removal, but the Twins themselves can just carry games on their own entirely. They also run quite a few revival effects for them as well. They can run things like Phoenix, which is just 2k ping to board and then just revive a Porum or a Palom, whichever one you don't have. Really good access to Amat and ways to search it. The deck also can go relatively wide if it needs to, and actually build pretty good kill pressure. May not be able to do it right away, but if you let the game state kind of stick for a few turns, you will hit a point where they will threaten to kill you pretty quickly. Or where the threats are too large to where if you can't answer a wide board, or you can't answer several of the larger problems, they will still run you over. They also do get to run some cards like Axstar, but a lot of their cards are not... They don't have a ton of 3-cost cards in the deck, so Axstar is kind of that double-edged sword. If it's going to dual freeze their own board, like it's going to hit the Tyvis, it's going to hit the Twins. And sure, it might freeze your board and get another body down, but at the same time, it's also denying them their kill pressure because they're dual freezing their own stuff.
Yeah.
Playing Axstar on their own turn, most of the time off of Tyvis. And if the Twins do kind of stay gone for too long, then the threat of the deck tends to stay gone for a little while. They do have more bodies they can put down, but Porum and Palom are the main threats. And if they can't stick on board and they can't come back, a decent amount of the game pressure that comes from it is also gone as well.
Yep. Gigawall in general, basically, this is a deck that is focused on playing 7-cost Warrior of Light on usually turn 2. You're going to use it either as a ramp spell or a way to throw out like really, really powerful, fast bodies. And like your entire deck will be cost 3. Some of the strengths, we call him Gigawall. 7-cost Warrior of Light is one of the most broken cards of all time.
This card's ludicrously good.
If you just hit 2 characters, doesn't matter what they are, he's generated more than you spent to play him. While also putting a big 9k on field. The special is absurd. As literally was in this.
I can't believe it doesn't cost any CP. I cannot believe they thought that was okay.
And it's the FF8 package is really crazy. You get the ability to self-mill, which is really good for the deck. It fuels the Gilgamesh, which is the win con of the deck. The other thing about this deck is it kills out of nowhere. Gilgamesh FFBE is probably the strongest, like, the game is over card. Especially when you factor in that you can give him complete untargetability while you're doing that. And then some of the other strengths. This is one of those decks that gets way... You wouldn't think this for a deck that is as random as it is, where you're flipping 5 cards with Warrior of Light. Gigawall decks get better the better the pilot of the deck. Good players of Gigawall are practically unbeatable, and bad players will not do nearly as well. It is wild how much better these decks are, the better you get. Couple weaknesses. Warrior of Light has a big target on his back with Amaterasu. It's not the end of the world even if that happens, because you kind of like... Warrior of Light then just says both players discard 3 cards usually, which is still fine. And it can get... Depending on what your hit is on Warrior of Light, it can be awkward. If you hit like a bunch of forwards that don't do anything, you can be very vulnerable to Shantoto. Maybe you hit a bunch of backups in a matchup where you need to be more aggressive. and it can struggle a little bit with longer games because maybe you just don't have the right colors. Because usually it's on this weird tricolor engine. So.
Yep. And then once again, non-targeting board wipes is what the deck can really struggle into, uh, especially things like Hecatouncher.
Yeah.
5 costs. I know that's not really in the meta right now, but to kind of put it in perspective, once 7-drop Bull hits board, most of the time you kind of want to leave him there.
Mm-hmm.
If you kill him and they play another one, then you're in a really rough spot because they're going to play 2 more cards for free again. But if you are able to somehow wipe through the board and keep that 7-drop Warrior of Light on board, to where they just can't play another one, then you can get through the problems that he's played, or the problems that Ultimate Shield is offering them, while still being able to kind of prevent them from doing it again. You still will run into more issues with Ultimate Shield, but I'd rather deal with one turn of an Ultimate Shield than deal with another 7-drop pool.
Yep.
Dropping 2 more cards for free. Just once again, it is also low skill floor, which is nice, at least to start. Once again, you can tell the difference between a good and a experienced Giga Bowl player, but it's fairly easy to just kind of pick up and go, and expect to do decently well.
Up next, Refugee Control. This is what I think the best deck in the game is right now. Basically, it's going to try to stack Warrior of Light backups, and then it's going to use Refia to do everything. Refia is a draw engine. She's a mana doubler. She's a removal engine. Once this deck gets set up, it's very difficult to keep Refia from running away with the game. Some of the biggest strengths, it's got a very, very even matchup spread. It does well into a lot of different types of decks. And it does well into aggression because it can run a very high EX count, especially if you're on a non-Bartz variant. Some of the weaknesses, sometimes you just don't hit the EX burst, which means that if that happens, the hard aggro does stop you. Decks like Knights, especially if you don't know that you're running in the Knights, could be a problem. It's very reliant on getting those backups into play. It also can struggle with random stuff like Ixion or Garuda. Everything in the deck just about costs 3 and has 7k power, so that can be a thing. And then also, Refia has a huge target on her back. A card like Cloud could be a huge problem for keeping her off the field.
Yep.
I think if you want more on this deck, I've got a full deck profile from the Florida Materia Cup in there.
Yep. Yeah, goes a good person doctor for this. Definitely in terms of damage thresholds, this is a big damage 3 scary deck, because Ferris on damage 3 and Arc on damage 3 are incredibly good.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have to push him to damage 3, don't push him to damage 3.
Yeah, if you can go from 2 to 7 in one turn, you should, basically.
Yep.
Realm Monsters, the Tori Kelly special. Basically, what's going to happen with this deck, we're going to try to play Realm on turn 2. Realm is absurd. She is one of very few cards in the game that generates as much increased value off of playing her as she does. And when she does, she'll play a 1-cost monster or a 2-cost monster. Usually the 2 cost is an Atomos. The 1 cost can be either Evray or a Goblin. It does not matter which one they play. It's still absurd. And yeah, this deck is a couple of the weaknesses. If you know you're against this, you have to Amaterasu the Realm. It sucks. You don't want to. You have to.
Yep. Don't let her play 2 things for free. Please don't.
This deck tends to somehow do pretty decently into aggro a lot of the time, which is very, very good. There's also a lot of different builds of this deck, but in general, the card to look out for is the Realm. If you see the Realm, you have to stop it, basically.
Yep. Main thing too is that in FF in general, there's just so few ways to actually answer monsters in particular. Mm-hmm. Forwards, you've got, the world is your oyster, kill it in whatever flavor you want. Monsters, there's really not a lot. Wind has access to Alexander. Earth has access to things like Neo Exdeath and the Shanteto LB. But there's really not much. Lightning also has, I guess, 1-drop EX Armu. But even thinking about any that are relatively being played, those are really the only things that come to mind. There's really not that many ways to interact with monsters in the game, which is why decks like this can be scary, because you can see the monsters building up and know there's nothing in your deck that can touch it. Yeah. And eventually they're just going to overwhelm you with the sheer amount of monsters that have hit board.
Something to consider, it's mentioned in weaknesses. This can be a matchup where if you know your Limit Break deck, you can say, I will not use any Limit Breaks, and just say, I have to Shantoto LB once I get to a later point in the game to remove the problems. And you just have to hope they don't have the Amaterasu sometimes with that.
Yep. Yep, Neo
Um,
Exith will also help as well if you're on Earth, so you can potentially have 2 different outs to the deck, and just pray they don't amot both. If they amot both, and extend the hand, you had a good game. But you tried.
by the way, John, that combo doesn't work. The Chimera actually targets on entry, so you can't steal with Melusine and then break that one that it's stealing. Warriors of Darkness, there's a full deck profile on this by Joey. Um, Basically, the TLDR on the deck is stop knocked. if
Yep.
you if you can't stop knocked, they're going to get a ton of free value and they're going to kill you in like 3 or 4 turns. If you do stop knocked, the deck becomes very awkward after a while because so many of the forwards are reliant on knocked for being a good deck.
Yep. So the strength behind it is once again he is insane, and honestly, turn 1, even going first, sometimes dumping your hand and playing him, like literally pitching 5 cards, play not, is sometimes not a bad play. Like it can actually get you there, especially if you know your opponent's on some kind of control deck or something. You might just almost win on the spot if they can't respond to it. Diana is also a ludicrously good card. That's highly, she's not undervalued in my opinion. But if some people look at her and think like this is a fine card, she's not a fine card. She's really good. Just at any point in time, Dole Warrior Darkness, Dole forward. Especially when you can get to Glaive on board and make your whole board brave. You're swinging 3 times for free and then removing 3 blockers on their turn, which they can't swing back either now. Goes back to your turn, you drop something with Alba, you get 4 swings and they're dead.
Yeah.
It also has an extremely low skill floor, simply because once again, if your game plan potentially turn 1 is play a backup pass and then turn 2 play not, ditching 4 cards in hand, it at that point you're just kind of drawing into other things that potentially do something, and then not himself is your game plan. Not Diana, Glaive, potentially Alba, and that on its own kind of runs you the game. It's essentially at that point free value you are generating that your opponent must respond to that you are committing nothing else to.
Yep.
You're playing backups, you're playing other forwards, you're doing basically the entire rest of your game plan, and the Warriors of Darkness just happen to keep accidentally sliding from your hand onto the field. Like they sneeze and all of a sudden there's a Diana there. That's just kind of how the game plays.
I would say also like this is kind of you can play Warriors of Darkness with a lot of different shells. I've seen Mono Earth, Earth Lightning, Earth Wind. A lot of those you can refer to other kind of decks in this for what those might do, or just kind of yeah.
And the Wind version I consider mine a bit different because the Warriors of Darkness themselves can either be run as kind of their own deck with cards meant to play around them, or they can be run as an engine, and you can focus on the rest. Earth Lightning builds will probably run a lot more reliant on it and kind of focus around the build a bit more, like potentially having some ways to cheat some things out as well. Whereas kind of like the build that I did where I did it with Retainers, it was just its own independent engine. If I was not able to drop Knocked early, then I would kind of give up on the Warriors of Darkness package the majority of the time, especially if I continuously draw into like my Glaives and Dianas and I really don't feel the value in playing Knocked anymore, especially if I run out of a particular target. Then I move into the other package and I kind of give up on this one and use it as CP. So
Cloud's
that way,
Existence helps a lot there.
yeah. It's also very reliant on keeping Not and Diana on board. Those 2 cards are the cards that get you there. Glaive and Alba are nice, but Diana and Not are the main 2 cards. If one of them stays gone for an extended... Like, if Not gets played and then immediately dies, you're in a rough spot, because you're probably not playing him again. He costs 9 and you dumped your hand. Diana as well, they're probably going to want to keep killing her over and over, so you want to either find ways to get her back or draw into your others. That's why I think if any of the other minor 3 are going to be a 3 of, it has to be Diana, because you want to see her. If you're playing Warriors of Darkness, Diana is your main piece. So she's gone, you're in a bad spot. And then as the game goes on too, the deck starts to lose value. At least the Warrior Darkness package starts to lose value as your opponent starts building up more and more threats or starts to get time to get to threat responses. Not gets you all that advantage early, and then if you're playing him late, it's, in my opinion, relatively a fair card. If you get to a late game situation, beginning of the game he's ludicrously good, but then later the game goes on, he goes from kind of good to eventually late game pretty bad because you're not searching 3 cards anymore, and you're playing a 3-drop forward for free. It's not going to be great.
Moving along. So a couple budget decks real quick. People are kind of new to the game, want to pick up some decks. What do you do that are cheap but could do well? I always will recommend any of the starter decks. So the 2 best ones that I think you could build right now are Retainers and 13 Aggro. The Retainer stuff, you could build a Retainer Warrior of Darkness deck for like the starter deck plus like a legend and a couple of extra cards and do relatively decent with just Retainers, Warriors of Darkness, and Bulk, effectively. 13 aggro is literally just like a couple of Bulk cards and 3 Amaterasu away from being a tiered deck. Realm herself is kind of expensive, but a lot of her targets are not. You can play a Realm deck that's not super expensive. Like, even the Realm Warrior list that Tori Kelly played, outside of, like, I think exactly the Demon, there's not a card in the deck that costs more than $5.
I think Tidus LB, but I think that's it as well.
Yeah.
Like, really, those two cards.
But the nice thing is, like, Tidus LB and the Demon will go in a lot of decks. So you don't have to feel bad about picking those up. Like, they're just good staple cards. Even then, like, if you don't want to do that, pure Warriors, Tyvus is maybe like a $1 hero, and a lot of his targets that you would want to get are not expensive either. I think Izuki is maybe like $1.50, $2. Peeing Mog is like 75 cents. Furian's only like $1 or $2. Like, it's very cheap to build a Warrior deck that can, like, help you learn the game while doing things. It's kind of the spot that I would replace. Like, this spot used to be like a Soiree spot, but now that, like, Warrior of Light is like a $40 card and kind of like is necessary for Soiree to be like a really good deck, I think like Warriors is probably the best other thing you could be playing. Especially if you like run stuff like the Rebel package is really cheap and really solid. And then lastly, Mono Water, thanks to the anniversary box. Like, if you get the 2024 anniversary box, you get 2 Lenas, 2 Leviathans, 2 Sarahs. That's like 90% of the expensive cards in Mono Water. You have to pick up a couple of Ashes, some more backups. You don't have to have Shinryu in Mono Water to be good. You can even play like Gigawall's like only like an $8 to $9 card. You can pick up 3 Gigawalls and play the Mono Water Gigawall variant. It's like a very cheap, very solid deck. Plays a lot of like bulk cards for its backups and its summons, and yeah. If you guys want to see these, by the way, go ahead and comment them in the YouTube description when I post this video there, and maybe I'll go through and I'll build all of these out in a separate video for like maybe sub $50 variants of all of these that I think could do pretty well. You can absolutely skip Glaciella in Mono Water. She is not necessary for the deck to be good. In fact, if you're playing budget, I would not buy Glaciella. Couple of quick questions. I gotta get going in just a little bit here. I'm kind of running late for a dinner. But I have time for like just a little bit if anybody has them real quick. And one last thing, thanks again to Joey for putting this together for me. And letting me share it with all of you. It's going to be highlighted. It's going to be on YouTube, so you can go there. And then if you have any questions, you can also put them in the YouTube comments there. But I think I probably need to be wrapping up the stream in just a little bit. So yeah, I'll give it just a little bit of time for some questions to roll in. Joey, you have any other things to bring up real quick?
No, I really don't think so. The main thing is, once again, the game is a lot of knowledge, as a lot of people can tell, and as people start to get used to the game, they'll realize there's so many different decks, so many different things to play, and there are quite a lot of cards. But fortunately, we do have some wonderful places where we can look at deck lists and kind of get access to that. And honestly, too, just have some fun with deck building. Once again, there's so much variety and so many random decks that people bring in that surprisingly do well. Don't ever feel like this isn't a game you can't cook up like random fun lists on, because you can cook up something that surprisingly will do very well. Have some fun with it, try out the things, get used to your locals, reach out to community too, and just see it or go from there. It is a very fun game, and I do think that, once again, people are doing a great job in showing that they want to get better with it, and hopefully, for those that were able to tune in and watch, it's hopefully either answered a few questions or made them feel a little bit more confident about either some things that they're doing or given them some new things to kind of think about as they go through and continue to play.
Opinion on tax-based effects. I don't think those two are particularly strong. Force Field Ultimecia I find is very easy to play around and ends up taxing you as much as it taxes the opponent usually. It's not usually worth the dark slot. And then Force of Man in Black has the worst name possible. And paying 3 is not that difficult because you pay 3 and both forwards are free. I do think there are tax-based effects that are good. I think Vanille, especially if you can get Vanille in like turn 1, turn 2, she's really, really, really annoying and very difficult to deal with. I think people sleep on Sarah Mobius. I think Sarah Mobius is a really obnoxious card. If she sticks around for a turn, and dealing with a 2CP 8K, you don't necessarily want to do that. But I think in general, if you give your opponent the ability to make decisions, that's usually worse than just saying you can't do that, which is what you usually want to do if you can. But that doesn't mean that all of the cards are bad. Like I said, Vanille, Sarah Mobius, Cecil's another one that can be really, really solid. but it is going to be matchup dependent as well. You don't have time for Sarah Mobius or Vanille to come online against decks like Knights. Yeah, I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and cut the stream. Thanks again, and thank you all again so much for 1,000 subscribers. It really means a lot. Joey, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely.
Playing Realm, Atomos, Evray, and Mono Water. If you have alternate targets, I wouldn't play just Atomos Evray as like your only two things, but if you have like Piranha and Blue Worms, absolutely consider it. It's a really good...
Tom Berry and stuff too are also very nice.
Yeah, I just would say like you have to make sure you have a one-cost water monster you're happy playing, whether it's Piranha or Sahagin. Yeah. Or Quadav, just like any of those. But yeah. Probably the next time you guys see me, I'll be in a different location.